Debating social movements. Firstly, what is a social movement? So a social movement is a form of collective action. It's a group of people that come together and engage in specific actions and strategies and essentially want to accomplish a certain change and implement changes in society. And they often emerge, especially in the case of progressive movements, which are the kinds that you will generally tend to see in debating, in response to inequality or oppression. They want to protect marginalized groups who face inequality and who face oppression, and collectivize to demand changes through democratic institutions, to politicians, and through social media, through a variety of different strategies. Black Lives Matter, the environmental movement, these are all examples. And these are the kinds of things that they do, and that's essentially their purpose. And just to give some examples, I mentioned already Black Lives Matter, the women's suffragette movement, national liberation movements against colonialism, LGBT movement, and a variety of other identity-based movements for minorities, sexual minorities, and so on. The feminist movement, the environmentalist movement, these are all social movements that are trying to accomplish a certain change, and so engage in a variety of different actions through things such as protests, social media campaigning, and so on, to try to attempt to get the changes that they want to see. And so the general goals of most movements, especially progressive movements, are to represent marginalized groups of people and to get them greater access to rights and often redistribute wealth and power. So these movements have the conception that society is often hierarchical, that there is often a majority group and a minority group, people who have power and people without power, and that ultimately we should seek to reduce that divide and flatten that disparity and give those who are disadvantaged as much equality with regards to rights and influence as possible. So hopefully all of that is clear. I'll now move on to important considerations when actually debating these motions about social movements and the kinds of issues that generally tend to come up. All right, more people joining. Okay, so Srinandan and Rajarshi, just what we've covered so far is what social movements are. So today we're just covering debating social movements and motions about social movements. And so far, I've just talked about how social movements are a form of collective action, a group of people with some degree of organization that try to enact certain changes in society and often emerge in response to inequality or oppression. And some examples are the women's suffrage movement, LGBT, feminist movement, national liberation movements against colonialism, etc. And their general goals are to represent marginalized people, to redistribute power and influence, and give greater access to rights to those who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. And so now moving on to the important considerations when debating social movements and the kinds of issues that come up in those kinds of debates is firstly diagnosing the problem. So this goes to the heart of what the movement actually stands for and the kinds of issues that they consider to be important. And it's important to remember that not all members will always agree with each other within a social movement, and that there's a variety of different subgroups within each movement. For example, choice feminism. So choice feminism generally advocates for the view that we should give women rights, of course, and we should allow them to do whatever they want, whether that be in favor with what feminism is trying to accomplish or not. So even if women choose to forego their careers and take care of children, or buy into cosmetic surgery, things that are traditionally considered reinforcing patriarchal norms, we should allow women to do those things as long as, it's their own choice. And so choice feminists advocate that regardless of what it is that women choose, we should allow them to choose whatever it is that they want. Whereas other women that tend to disagree with choice feminism argue that we should criticize women who are reinforcing patriarchy, and that actually they're not making a free choice out of their own will, but rather patriarchal norms are just ingrained within them, and that even though they think that they're making a free choice, that these norms are so pervasive that we shouldn't allow women to make those choices because it's coerced, and that ultimately we should seek to further the goals of feminism by trying to tear down those kinds of norms and so on. Or another example is pro-life versus pro-choice. So within the feminist movement, you will have women who are pro-life, who are against abortion, versus women who are for abortion. And in many debates, there will be a question of whether you should allow women who disagree on these kinds of issues to still be a part of that movement, and whether the movement should allow for that debate internally and allow women to decide to advocate for either one of those issues, or whether the movement should restrict its membership and make sure that people buy into a certain conception of what feminism actually is. And so in many debates, you will question the very goals of these movements and try and determine whether it's beneficial for there to be internal debate about these kinds of issues, and whether one conception of these movements is better than the other or more effective than the other in achieving its goals. Now, the second issue with movements is leadership structures. So firstly, who should lead these movements? And it's often important to recognize the kinds of individuals who are able to rise to the top if there is a leadership structure to begin with. And those often tend to be privileged members of those very marginalized groups. So for the feminist movement, you will often have white women or wealthy women being the ones who rise to the top. And it's important to recognize why that is. That is often because these women are the ones who have the influence to be heard and to get their voice out there, or just have the free time to be able to dedicate their life towards these kinds of causes, whereas women who come from disadvantaged backgrounds will probably be busy with their careers and trying to make ends meet. But also the question of whether majority members, such as men, for example, should be allowed to be a part of the feminist movement, but also specifically lead the feminist movement and be advocates for and spokespersons for the movement at all. And again, there's two sides to that coin. There's a side that says that no, they shouldn't, because this will crowd out the voices of women. This will make women feel uncomfortable, that they don't have a safe space. And this will make it seem as if women need to rely on men to get the changes that they want to see again. Whereas on the other side, you might argue that we're able to get far more support if we allow men to be leaders. You signal to men that they're also welcome as part of the feminist movement and they should support it, and that it's compatible with their own identities. And that it makes you appear less radical because you aren't just seen as a fringe movement that, you know, hates men, but rather you're accepting of all groups and you're just trying to further equality for all. And so in many instances, this debate comes down to whether you should ensure sort of the identity purity of that movement and make sure that minorities and those who are disadvantaged have, you know, a monopolistic access to that movement and are the only ones who are given the right to speak on behalf of it, or whether you should compromise to some degree to get more influence. But the second issue is, what kind of structure should it be? Lots of movements have a hierarchical or vertical structure, much like a corporation, where there's leaders who are spokespeople. So the environmental movement, for example, has leaders such as Greta Thunberg who speak on behalf of it. The animal rights movement has very hierarchical structures such as PETA, which are run by corporate executives. But you also have horizontal movements that are very democratic and don't have a very strong leadership structure. So the feminist movement, for example, doesn't really have you know, a very strong hierarchical structure. There's probably leaders on a much more local level, or you have movements that are entirely leaderless, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, which doesn't have any specific leaders, but rather just collectively tries to enact change through things such as protests and reforms, and trying to reform the police through social media and so on. So there's a big spectrum of whether these structures are very vertical and hierarchical, like a corporation, or whether they're completely just down to the consensus of what people believe in, the discussions that happen on social media, and so on. And often the question will be, which kind of leadership structure is better, and are leaders good? And it comes down to whether you value that sort of structure that allows the movement to have a sense of direction, or whether you allow for more democracy and allow people to choose. And also what kind of leaders end up succeeding, because if it's the case that it's privileged minorities, will they be able to represent the views of the population well? And so perhaps it might not be a good idea to have a hierarchical structure, and perhaps it might be better to be democratic in that sense. And the third issue I wanted to discuss is, what kind of strategies do these movements actually end up choosing? And often in debates, you will have, you know, just two neutral strategies and then discussing whether that's good or bad. So, for example, should the environmental movement focus on the positive side of all the changes that we've made, or should they focus on the negative side? and obviously then you might consider which narrative is more persuasive, but often you will have debates about a trade-off. That is, one, ideological purity. So should you stay true to your core values and beliefs, or should you compromise and try and access more efficacy and support? So, for example, you might have a debate about whether minority groups and the Black Lives Matter movement should seek to work within the police and try to reform the police, or whether they should try and tear it down. And many people who argue for ideological purity will argue that you should tear it down, that this is an institution that has done the African American community harm, especially in countries like the United States, and that it's an institution that's inherently corrupt, and we shouldn't stand for it. But on the opposition, you might argue that we need to get the support of majority members who will often view you as radical if you say we should defund the police, or that it might be better to reform the police and work from within the police to try and reform its issues, even if we think that it's a flawed institution. And so often you might have to compromise on the principles of that movement in order to gain more support and to be more appealing to members of the majority. And there will often be debates about what is that tipping point and to what extent should we compromise on those values and on those beliefs. And the second question that often comes up is, to what extent should we advocate for radical action versus trying to compromise and seek moderates? So people who advocate for radical action will often claim three things. The first is that it's necessary. So in the case of, let's say, the environmental movement, if you think of Extinction Rebellion, you might say that, look, even though these actions are radical, we need to act now, because if we don't, then we'll be past the point of no return, and there will be no way to reverse global warming, and that will lead to catastrophic impacts. The second line on which people who propose for radical action argue for is that it's justified, that these institutions that you're often attacking, let's say in the case of Black Lives Matter, protesting and rioting against corporations who have done them harm, or the environmental movement doing the same, or let's say animal rights movement doing the same for farms and corporations that treat animals badly, that this is just a proportional response to what these bad actors and these bad institutions have done, and so it's justified to take radical action or enact violence against them. And the final reason is that perhaps it's practically beneficial by using it as a bargaining tool. So obviously sowing instability throughout a country by shutting down infrastructure or engaging in violent riots is not something that the government or corporations want, because it hurts their own incentives to have a stable government or to be able to run their corporations and make profits and so on. And so you can use it as a bargaining tool. So you can say, look, we'll stop these riots, we'll stop this violent action if you concede and give us what we want and give rights to these people or whatever it is that you're demanding. And so this radical action can use a bargaining tool as a practical means to achieving the change that you want. There's asked a question. Sorry, could you just unmute and ask it? I don't think.
Yeah, so would you usually use like moral principles, as we talked about yesterday, to prove radical action is justified if it's unlikely to realistically work?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. So, there's a variety of principles that you can argue under, even if it might not necessarily succeed. So one example is self-defense. The principle that if you are under threat, it is justified to act in self-defense, even if the chances of success are very small. And so it's justified to take radical action in the idea of self-defense. And so for the environmental movement, you might argue that, corporations causing global warming is literally a threat to you and your children. And so it's justified to act in self-defense as a proportionate measure. Or you might argue along the lines of reparations that the fact that, let's say, the African American community has had so much violence inflicted upon them means that it's a proportionate and principally justified to act out proportionally against the institutions that have done them harm, because that balances the scale. So yeah, definitely you would be using principled arguments, or if not quasi-principled intuitions, to justify why it's the case that it's justified to take this radical action. Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, that's an overview of what social movements are, what their goals are, and the kinds of issues that they often come across in the context of debating specifically. and so the issues that you should consider when thinking about different arguments as to why social movements might want to act a certain way or be structured in a certain way and have certain values. Are there any questions?